Australia is on fire. Global climate change is the cause. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is denying climate change. In fact, his entire political party, his right-wing party, is denying it. Turns out Rupert Murdoch is not denying it. So we checked in with the head of Greenpeace Australia to get the whole story on what's going on there, both politically and ecologically. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. On the line with us is David Ritter, the CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, the author of his latest book, the Coal, C-O-A-L, Coal Truth. Greenpeace.org.au is the website, and you can tweet him at David_Ritter, R-I-T-T-E-R. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Tom.
And thank you for joining us from Australia. I'm seeing these photographs of the fires that are going on in your country and on your continent, which is roughly the same size as the continental United States. And it seems apocalyptic. What's the current status of the fires?
Well, the fires are still burning, and I have to say it is a very sad time to be an Australian. Our fire season normally, before global warming started, was conventionally thought to start in December and to run through the summer months of December, January, February. The fires this season started in September, so much earlier than they should have. And they've now burned through an area of around 8.5 million hectares, which, to give some idea, is bigger than Scotland. There are fires still burning in every Australian state. There are 6 Australian states. And the fires themselves, in addition to just destroying vast areas of our country, have also bathed our eastern cities in toxic smoke. So Melbourne and Sydney, cities famous for their blue skies, have been bathed in the kind of toxic smoke that Australians are not used to, and have made our cities during this period at times some of the most polluted in the world.
Now, I understand that on the ecological side of this, the best estimates are about 1 billion animals, including a number of potentially or endangered species, or what may be as a consequence of these fires, endangered species, have died. It almost seems like there should be a disturbance in the force when 1 billion sentient beings vanish from the earth or are burned up. And also, I was over at Media Matters earlier today, and the headline is, amid raging fires, Rupert Murdoch's Australian media empire turns a blind eye to climate crisis. A, you want to speak to the ecology of that, and B, what is happening in your country with regard to the media and the politics of this?
Yeah, the impact on our ecology is truly dreadful. Australia is one of the 17 megadiverse countries in terms of its plants and animals in the world. And that's best known internationally, I suppose, through some of our iconic animals, the kangaroos and koalas and so on. What's happened through the fires has been described as by one scientist as a bit of a biological Armageddon, because large areas of biodiverse region have simply been destroyed. And our plants and animals were already under great strain in this country. Sadly, in recent years, we just do not have a great record in protecting our flora and fauna. And so animals that were already endangered or critically endangered or vulnerable have been pushed to the brink and may in fact end up as extinct as a consequence of the fires. Because you say when you kill 1 billion or 500 million, the numbers are necessarily estimates of creatures that has a terrible, terrible impact on their viability as species. But when you use language like viability of species, you can lose that visceral impact that just seeing the images of charred animal bodies burned alive, of terribly badly injured animals by fire. Those images, along with those of families grieving for the 25 lives lost so far, along with images of children grieving for their homes lost or just fleeing as refugees in their own country. But those images are now seared onto Australian minds. And as you point out, it is obscene in this context that we have seen many, many years of systematic denial of the reality of global warming, of the climate emergency by the Murdoch-owned newspapers in Australia. And there are a number of states where the only significant paper is owned by News Limited, and the influence of the Murdoch press is significant. And it's not merely a systematic editorial pattern of playing down the climate emergency and its consequences. It's also the perpetual featuring of opinion writers who advance the most sort of outlandish theories about that run contrary to all the accepted and reputable science. So it really has been this systematic pattern of denial, of downplaying, and in the context of this country that has been on fire, it is just particularly abhorrent.
Yeah. We're talking with David Ritter, the CEO of Greenpeace Australia, greenpeace.org.au. David, what is Greenpeace doing in Australia with regard to all this? What are you all doing?
Well, we are above all, I suppose, standing with those impacted communities. Like many others in Australia, we dug deep at the end of last year to support the many communities that have been impacted by the fires. But as a campaigning organisation with a vision of an Earth capable of nurturing life in all of its magnificent diversity, we've seen it as our role to do two things. One has been to scaffold the stories of survivors. So, for example, towards the end of last year, we enabled a couple whose house had been burned down in the fires to take the remains of their house to Canberra and display it outside the walls of our parliament in a very dignified and moving protest that the images of which travelled around the world. So it's that kind of scaffolding of survivors' stories. And then the other thing that we see as a crucial role in this, and remembering there are hundreds of thousands of Australians who are involved in the Greenpeace network, we see it as being crucial that we continue to draw that connection, that it is the conditions brought on by climate change that have been generative of the conditions that have made for these fires. So it's climate, it's the emissions from coal, from oil, from gas, driving the climate emergency, and the climate emergency driving the catastrophic fires. And in an Australian context, coal is the problem here. Roughly a third of our emissions, domestic emissions in Australia, come from burning coal in the coal-burning power stations, and we are one of the two largest coal exporting nations in the world. So Australia is making a really outsized contribution to the problem of the climate emergency because of our coal, oil and gas.
Here in the United States, we have what used to be two brothers. Now one of them has passed away, David Koch, and Charles, his brother, is left, whose daddy made his fortune in the fossil fuel industry, drilling for oil for Joe Stalin, and then came back to the United States and made more money with fossil fuels. And they built an empire. It's now diversified beyond fossil fuels, but Koch Industries, basically a fossil fuel company, and they have been funding and leading much of the climate denial movement, at least over the last few decades. Is there an analog to that in Australia? Somebody who is just obscenely, fabulously rich? I think the Koch brothers were the second or third richest, family in the United States, behind the Waltons and maybe Bill Gates. Is there an analog to that in Australia, where you have a coal baron or an oil baron who has so much money that he or she is just completely distorting the politics of your country?
Well, there's probably not one. There hasn't probably historically been one single analogue, and maybe I could give an answer in three parts. And the first part is that Some of what has afflicted you in the US has, of course, travelled internationally, because we know that there are these links of fossil fuel interests, of climate denial that are transnational. US climate denial is exported to Australia, and Australia exported elsewhere, and so on. So there are those transnational links. That's the first thing to say. Then the second thing to say is that probably over time in Australia, it has more been a group of interests that have acted together to block progress. They used to, more than 10 years ago, they used to jokingly describe themselves as the greenhouse mafia, because they were so proud of the way in which they had stalled progress on climate action in Australia. And that is both in terms of lobbying done from within individual companies, but also some peak industry bodies like the Minerals Council of Australia and the Business Council of Australia, which have just repeatedly and vigorously opposed decent climate action, to the point where you end up with a Prime Minister or future Prime Minister carrying a lump of varnished coal into Parliament and saying there's nothing to be scared of. Mm-hmm. And then the third part I would give to your answer is that we did see, just before the last national election in Australia, one particular person, a miner called Clive Palmer, who is reported to have spent somewhere between 50 and 60 million Australian dollars in a matter of weeks just before our just before our national election. And the impact of that money was not to get Mr. Palmer's party a single seat in either chamber of our national legislature, but he did boast afterwards, I think it's a direct boast from him, that the effect of it had been to keep the Labor Party, which is in Australia the closest analogue, I guess, we have to the US Democrats, out of office. So there are certainly analogues to what you've experienced in the US.